I don't think any musician would tell you that the heroine in any way added to their musical genius. It might have kept the high that one experiences from the creation of art in the moment alive for just a second, but the cost of that was nothing creative.
How about the importance of the race factor?
This is the only reason why I do these films. If I'm curious about the way my country ticks, then I realize at the heart of my country is a monumental hypocrisy. We are a free nation, and yet when we were founded and proclaimed that everyone was free, there were millions of black Americans who were not free. This is an amazing tension. This is an amazing narrative. And so you find that the Constitution refers to African Americans as 3/5 of a person with no voting rights. Baseball is called the national pastime for 100 years, but it takes till 1947 for African Americans to come in to the national pastime and so provide a heroic counterpoint. And then, of course, at the heart of jazz is the story of African Americans. So we can see the racial narrative in America from a tragic point of view, but we can also see it from a heroic point of view, from a sophisticated point of view, from an elegant point of view, from an artistic point of view. Because what we have is an art form that is utterly American, but also utterly African American. It's an indigenous music to start off with, but it has wings, and it is able to be shared with the rest of the country and now the world. And so jazz is a recognized art form. If it could only be played by African Americans, it would just be a folk music. African Americans happen to be the best practitioners, but jazz can be played, can be understood by anyone. And so what we're doing is we're celebrating a great American mythology. And at the heart of the mythology is this tension about race. And what I've tried to do at great controversy in my own professional life is to try to share both the positive and the negative aspects of that story wherever I can find it, whether it's in the Civil War and the black soldiers who fought, or the war itself, which came because of slavery, whether it's baseball or now jazz, as a way into the soul of the country. So the jazz series is not just 2 or 3 dozen biographies and 150 other people who crossed the stage like bit players. It's the story of the 20th century in America, about 2 world wars and a devastating depression and the soundtrack that got America through the most difficult of times. It's about sex, the way men and women speak to one another through the ritual of courtship, through the mating call that this jazz music is. It's about drug abuse and the terrible cost of addiction. It's about great cities, their birth and decay, and it is hugely about race.
Your series starts in New Orleans, where jazz originated. Tell us about the origins of jazz in New Orleans.
I call the first episode Gumbo. Gumbo is the name for a soup that comes from New Orleans that is a particular mixture of ingredients, lots of different things. So jazz is born through a set of musical and social and political events in the 19th century. It has French and Italian operas, Scotch, Irish folk songs and hymns. It has Caribbean rhythms. It has slave songs and the polyrhythms of the African tribes. It has spirituals. It has minstrel music. It has dozens and dozens of influences that completely coalesce at the time of the 19th century to make this music called jazz. But it needs several important ingredients. One is ragtime, which is this loud, jaunty, propulsive sound, and the other is the blues. Now you say you can't have a gumbo, a soup, without this music, without the soup having a roux. Well, the roux in the gumbo of jazz is the blues, this utterly American invention that helps, at the turn of the century, make this music what we call jazz, all born in New Orleans.
For the benefit of our viewers in Brazil, give us a general panorama how the series is divided up.
Essentially, it's a chronological story that moves from the 19th century. The first episode is the founding of jazz in New Orleans, all of these different ingredients that go in to make it, plus the social ingredients of emancipation, of Jim Crow, the separation of blacks and whites after emancipation, lynchings, all sorts of social and political things that force the Creole population in New Orleans to be with the black population and bring the Creole European virtuosity with the blues-infected sounds of the black musicians and helping to create this hybrid. Then each subsequent episode is an attempt to understand the decades of jazz throughout the 20th century, up until about 1975, because this is a history, and history is about stories that are done. Journalism is about stories that are ongoing, and so while we celebrate with a wonderful, impressionistic, final sense of where jazz has been the last 25 years and where it's going, our narrative more or less comes to a stop with the death of Armstrong and Ellington, and with Miles Davis proclaiming in 1975 that jazz is dead, the music of the museum. But before that, you've gotten to know an amazing array of characters, from Sidney Bechet and Jellywell, Morton and Louis Armstrong, to Duke Ellington and Fletcher Henderson and Paul Whiteman, to Count Basie and Benny Goodman and Artie Shaw, to Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, Thelonious Monk, Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Charles Mingus, Billie Holiday, Ella Fitzgerald, a whole array of people, and many, many other people, and all of the movements, the original New Orleans sound, the way that was changed and transformed in Chicago, the elegant new sort of orchestrated Armstrong, they called it, the pre-swing big band sound in New York City of Ellington and Fletcher Henderson, the great explosion of jazz in the swing era, the war years in which jazz became a symbol of freedom throughout the world, bebop, hard bop, cool, modal, free, avant-garde, fusion, all of the different waves of sound. And now we celebrate today jazz as a world music, taking again the infectious pulse of the Caribbean and making it its own, the infectious pulse of Brazil, the infectious pulse of other cultures, and mixing it with other cultures now playing it. I mean, people in Sweden today are swinging as much as anyone else, which is good to see.
You say your series stops just about there in 1975, but obviously by your own definition, jazz continues to progress. You know,
and
what has it come to?
The last 40 minutes of the film really details the richness and the diversity, but as a historian I lack the historical perspective to offer judgments, and when my critic friends complain about the lack of things in the last 25 years, I say, but who among today's players are as important as Ellington or Armstrong or Coltrane or Parker? And they say, well, we'll have to wait 25 years. Yes, but jazz is ongoing, and the film celebrates the fact that it is now perhaps as rich and as textured and as varied as any art form that is out there today.
A series as broad as this one, covering such a long period, necessarily would not satisfy every single person, be it a aficionado of jazz or not. So you would necessarily get some people who say you didn't have enough of this, or you put too much emphasis on that. Yeah. What kind of general complaints did you hear along these lines?
It's a very good complaint. I made the decision early on that I did not want to be a telephone book, an encyclopedia, a dictionary. I wanted to be a story, a narrative. So I knew that I would have to pick and choose several symbolic and emblematic stories and individuals and tell them well, rather than try to tell every story and end up telling none well. So inevitably, the jazz aficionado says, oh, where is so-and-so and where is so-and-so, showing off as much what they know. Listen, if you've made a film that's 17 and a half hours and the only complaint is what you've left out, then you've done a good job. But inevitably, you have to perform this kind of triage that permits the most important people. What I did, in order to be fair, was to assemble a body of advisors, historians, critics, writers, across every spectrum of jazz, and to ask them what are the signal and important stories to tell, and to listen to them so that we haven't left out anybody more important than the people who are there. There are people who are equally as important, but for various reasons we chose. The most important thing, though, is I did not make it for the jazz specialist. The jazz specialist has like a very greedy miser, held jazz too close for too many years and given the impression to the rest of us that you need some sort of advanced degree to understand jazz. Whereas anyone who loves this music knows, as Louis Armstrong said, that there ain't but two kinds of music in this world, good music and bad music. And good music, you tap your foot to. So I made a film directed to everyone who was sort of afraid of jazz, who needed to be drawn in by story and by an explanation of the basic history of this music. And what's been great in the United States, despite the criticism from a few jazz critics, is that I've received the best reviews of my life as a filmmaker, the very, very best. Jazz music sales in America, the music itself, have doubled. The book is the most best-selling jazz book of all time.
The book about the series.
The book that accompanies the series. And the music that we have brought that accompanies it. We have several different things, a single CD, 22 best of artists, and then a 5 CD set. That 5 CD set has gone platinum, which is 1 million sales, which has never happened in the entire history of jazz, that a box set has gone platinum. So what we've done is we've not offered the last word on jazz, but the first word on jazz, to welcome everyone into this family and say, come and understand the freedom and liberation and joy that's implicit in a music which has at its heart affirmation in the face of adversity, which is the story of the American Negro, but also the story of all of us humans as we struggle with whatever life brings our way. Here is a music to chase the blues away.
The series itself is going around the world.
It's playing around the world. It's been bought by many countries. The video cassettes and the DVDs are selling now all around the world. I've been stunned by the response to it. President Clinton, before he left office, came in. He and I stayed up all night playing jazz music. Amazing number of people who you wouldn't think are fans are writing letters expressing the story of jazz as close to their heart. And I've created what I believe is a trilogy that's taken me 17 years to do, of the Civil War, baseball, and jazz.
Help us understand a bit your way, your style of working as a documentary filmmaker. When you approach a subject like jazz, do you know beforehand what you're going to do, or you develop as it comes along?
I think the problem with most documentaries, the reason why people find them so dull and boring, as if it's some medicine you have to take, hold your nose to take, that's good for you but not good tasting, is because it's usually the expression of the filmmaker telling you what they already know. But all art is a process of discovery. Cézanne discovers in the act of painting the oranges more about the essence of the orange than he knew going in. I pick topics that I'm relatively ignorant of and then immerse myself, in the case of jazz, for more than 6 years to try to understand it, to try to come to grips with it. And that means that the film that I make is sharing my process of discovery. And make no mistake about it, I'm not naive. I engage the services of the best historians and writers and critics there are to help me understand. But then I am free to come to decisions very much like an ordinary person, ignorant but curious. And so the film's success around the world, all of the film's success, I think is due in part to this process of discovery. I've also tried to use history not as some dull, boring subject, where you have a slideshow of images that you don't get close to. But I have, for the last 25 years, sort of pioneered a style of filming, re-photographing old photographs to make them come alive, to treat them not as some dead relic of the past, but the closest thing we have to a live moment. So I treat an old photograph the way a Hollywood feature filmmaker would a wide shot, with medium shot, close-up, insert, pan, tilt, cutaway, all the possibilities of a dramatic film, and shoot each image with that in mind. And not only do I see it through the viewfinder, I listen to it. Are those soldiers' feet tromping? Are those cannon firing? Are the birds fluttering away as the battle begins? Is the bat on the baseball cracking? Is the crowd yelling? Is the glasses in the bar tinkling? Can you hear the trombone player tuning up? What are the sounds of that old photograph? And so we have a complex, dense sound effects track, original music, the first-person commentary commentary of people of the times in diaries, journals, newspaper accounts, criticisms, love letters, all to make it come alive, and we hope a poetically written third-person narration. And I think all of these things come together and create a moment where, as William Faulkner said, history is not was, but is. That's what I'm looking for. That moment when the Battle of Gettysburg comes alive. That moment when you feel like you're with Jackie Robinson. That moment when you feel that there you are with Coleman Hawkins suddenly playing Body and Soul, an old familiar tune, in such a new and extraordinary way that you know it's the beginning of a revolution that will eventually be called bebop.
Is television your favorite outlet?
It wasn't. I'm a filmmaker. I shoot on film, I edit on film, I finish on film. I like to hope and pray that those people who will see my films will be in a dark room with many, many other people. But alas, in my country, the sources of funding to make these films, and they are expensive to make because they're so time-consuming, has to come from television. And the various foundations and government granting agencies and corporations that contribute to these films require that I put it on TV. But then a wonderful thing happens. Instead of making a documentary that's seen by 1,000 people, 10,000 people, maybe 100,000 people if I'm lucky, the films are now seen by 50, 60, 70 million people every time they're shown, which means that in America, more people get their history from these films than from any other source. And so what happens is that you begin to create, since the subject is in some ways the same. You know, I make the same film over and over again. Who are we? Who are we? Who are we Americans? Who are these strange and complicated people who occupy this continent? Who are we? That's the source of the films.
America is your focus, both the country and the people. Could you see yourself doing a documentary on a foreign subject in a different country?
I have, for someone as identified with my own country and its history, I have found myself drawn inexorably to other countries and other ways of life and other people. I travel around the world. And yet, every time I've been poised to do something on someone else, on another topic, on another country, I've retreated to the fact it may be as if Cézanne always returned to his beloved mountain or the bowl of oranges on his kitchen table, and that would suffice to explore the mysteries of the universe. For me, I find the infinite number of stories in American history, at least for now, a source of enough curiosity for me that I can't imagine leaving it for long.
Have you considered or have you had offers to do commercial films, feature films, outside of the documentary area?
I have, since the beginning of my career making films, been asked by Hollywood to make films, and I enjoy complete artistic control. In the early days of being a documentary filmmaker, that was given because no one else was willing to take it. Now I have it by default, and I won't give it up. And if I went to Hollywood, as I once did, to anticipate making a film on Jackie Robinson, the loss of control was too great for me to handle. I never want, let me put it a different way. I never want to be sitting here talking to you and telling you that the reason why you don't like a film of mine is because they made me cut it, or they gave me the writer I didn't want, or they didn't give me enough money, or some such thing. If you don't like my films, I am very proud to say it is all my fault. And that is the way I want it to be.
You want to be known for your own mistakes.
I want to be responsible for my own mistakes, if they are. If you don't like that film, I apologize. It's my fault. I never want to say, oh, it's that guy who is my producer, or this money man, or the studio that didn't distribute it right. If you don't like this film, it's because of mistakes I've made. On the other hand, if you like this film, if you're drawn to it, I can say that it is because of the hard work of a team of people that I've worked with, in some cases for more than 20 years, who have been able to shape, almost like a family working on a project, this ongoing story of who are we, this ongoing story of America.
It's a teamwork, but it's not a democratic work.
It is definitely not democratic. At the time of editing, if you were the woman who was cleaning out the waste paper baskets and you leaned in and you said, boy, I don't like that section on Charlie Parker, I would pay attention. But at the end, when at the end of the day or the end of the week or the end of the episode, I make the decision. That's absolutely the way it has to be. Art is never democratic. Film is a wonderfully collaborative medium, and I would not be speaking to you without the extraordinary collaboration I've had with amazing human beings, particularly my co-writer Jeffrey Ward, and cinematographers and editors that I've worked with throughout time.
But the final decision is yours.
The final decision has to be mine, has to be mine.
What are your future projects? What are you working on right now?
I'm working on a series of things. One on the history of the national parks in America. They were called America's Best Idea by Theodore Roosevelt. The first time land had been set aside for the people. That wasn't a private hunting preserve for a nobleman, but the idea that for posterity land could be set aside. Wonderfully beautiful places that have rich histories. I'm making a film on Jack Johnson, the black boxer who forced white America to come up with what they called the Great White Hope. Some white man who would have some chance of beating Jack Johnson, and never did in a fair fight. I'm working on a film on World War II from a kind of ordinary people perspective. The letters and the journals, the diaries of people back home or in the trenches trying to come to terms with the worst event in American history, in world history.
To finish up, for the benefit of our viewers, those who are both aficionados of jazz and those who are not, what can you tell them about your series? What are they going to find in it that they probably don't expect to find?
They will find a history of this music. They will find a biographical introduction to this music's most important people. But they will also find a history of the 20th century in America. And because of that, they will find a window onto the past of the United States of America. They will find a mirror that reflects back at them not only the American tendencies, good and bad, but human tendencies, good and bad. And because we are dealing with a subject so spiritually all-encompassing as jazz music is, this is also a prism through which we may see refracted not just all of these human tendencies, but a sense of our own redemptive future possibilities as human beings. Because the model of jazz is a model of human communication and cooperation that is without peer, without equal. And when we are drawn to jazz, we are drawn to an essential human, not American, not African American, but human sense of freedom and possibility. And so I see in this a future look at where my country might go. But I think anyone can look at this and see in the model of jazz the possibilities of where they too might go with the secrets that are embedded in this music.